I worked with a small congregation in southern Indiana. I was living at home with my parents at the time, driving about 25 miles to the church building to work with this little group. We met in an old white frame building that was over 100 years old, no indoor plumbing, 2 paths to 2 little buildings out back. You know what I'm talking about. They had partitioned off a corner of the auditorium, and that was the only classroom. I remember for a period of time, I taught the kids in that class, and the ages ranged, if I'm remembering correctly, from 4 to 18. Because I was driving over, I had a standing invitation to eat lunch with Bruce and Betty Shearer on Sundays if I didn't have any other invitation. And to be honest, Betty was such a good cook that I kind of wished that I didn't get other invitations. And that means that I spent a lot of Sunday afternoons with Bruce and Betty Shearer, and as a result, we developed a close relationship. Betty made really good chocolate pie. But we would sing hymns and we would discuss the Bible. 3 of their 4 children were at home at the time. Bruce and Betty were good parents. I worked with that church for 4.5 years and then moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky. I've not had as much contact with them since I left. Occasionally I will see them. And we pick up kind of like where we were when we last saw one another. But after I moved away, there was great anguish and heartache that came into the hearts of Bruce and Betty because their oldest son wound up in prison. He began to drink alcohol in high school and then moved on to drugs, and that led to burglary, 27 burglaries. And finally, the law caught up with him, and he was convicted, and he spent time in prison. What do I say as a preacher to hurting parents? There were 2 couples in the church in Texas where I labored for almost 6 years who wound up with sons in prison. When I was preaching in Johnson City, I had an opportunity to study with a prisoner in prison in Mountain City, Tennessee, about an hour's drive away. I baptized him into Christ. And sometime later, I was able to meet his mother, who was in a nursing home at the time in Coleman, Alabama. I have said all that to say, I know these hurting parents. And I stand before you this morning with the firm belief that there is a balm in Gilead. I also stand before you with the keen awareness that I speak to some hurting parents in this very assembly. I know that because we have had brief conversations. You have expressed to me your concern for your children who are not serving the Lord as they should, as you would like. And so I want to try to say something this morning that will help you. And the first thing that I want to say is that you're not alone. And I know that because, as I've already mentioned, I know a lot of parents who have children who have disappointed them. I know many parents who have children who are good, moral people. They work hard. They're good mates. They're good parents. They're good neighbors. But they're just not interested in spiritual things. I know parents who have children who have not obeyed the gospel, or they have returned to the world. I know parents who have children who have obeyed the gospel, but they're just not very involved in the work in a local church. They do not read and study their Bible regularly. They do not pray very much. They do not worship and serve God on a regular basis. I know parents who have children who are interested in spiritual things, but they've left the truth of the gospel for the errors of denominationalism. I know parents who have children who are not living as they ought to live. They're involved in drunkenness and drugs and immorality, and they show very little remorse about their wicked lifestyle. What I'm saying, brothers and sisters, I know a lot of parents who have wayward children. Now, this is not a unique phenomenon to our own day and age, because I can read about parents in the Bible who suffered great anguish because of their wicked children. May I remind you that the sons of Eli, the 14th judge of Israel, were wicked, evil, ungodly men, and this was terribly distressing to Eli. The sons of Samuel were wicked men as well. It's interesting to me that Samuel grew up, you might say, in the household of Eli. He witnessed that family dynamic. He saw with his own eyes what happened to Eli's sons, and yet the same thing happened to his own children. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, the record says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice." If you're familiar with the story of David's life, you know that at least 3 of David's sons must have been a great disappointment to him. Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, and Absalom, to avenge Tamar, winds up having Amnon murdered 2 years later. And then some years after that, Absalom tried to take the throne of his father away from him. and died in battle as a result. And shortly before David died, his son Adonijah tried to usurp the throne that was intended for David's son Solomon. And so may I say to you this morning, if you are a hurting parent, you're not alone. There are other parents besides you who have tossed and turned on their beds at night. There are other parents like you who have wept a bucket of tears until there are no more tears to cry. And there are other parents who have cried out in agony to God on behalf of their wayward children, seemingly to no avail. Now, I mention this because although it may be small consolation, I do believe that it should be some consolation for you to know that there are other parents just like you who are hurting too. I am reminded of the words of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, when he speaks about an entirely different subject. He says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." And then Peter says, resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing, here's the part I want you to think about, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. What was Peter telling his brethren? He was telling them, if you're facing persecution, if you're hurting, if you're suffering, just know you're not alone. Just remember, every gang member, every murderer, every dopehead, every thief that we read about in the headlines in the newspaper is somebody's son or daughter, and that means there's a lot of hurting parents out there. Now, I know that not every parent cares as they should, but many of them do. There are many parents who feel the same kind of hurt and the same kind of anguish that you feel. And if you'll stop and think about it, I'm sure you know of other parents in other churches who are hurting just like you are. And you can look at the folks in this church sitting in front of you or behind you or across the aisle from you and see parents who are hurting like you are hurting. And so the first thing I would say to you is you're not alone. And the second thing that I would say to you is you're not necessarily responsible. I suppose the questions that are most often asked by parents who have indifferent or wayward children are these: where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? Am I right about that? Well, the fact of the matter is there are just no perfect parents. Every parent makes mistakes. Even the very best parents make mistakes. But I'm here to tell you that you're not necessarily responsible for the waywardness of your children. Now, please notice how I said that. I chose those words very carefully. I said you're not necessarily responsible. I wish that I could tell every hurting parent, you're not responsible, period, exclamation mark. But I can't say that. Because sometimes parents are partially responsible for the waywardness of their children. The inspired historian tells us that King Jeroboam influenced his son Nadab to walk in his wicked ways. Children sometimes follow in the footsteps of their parents, and the footsteps of their parents aren't always walking in the right way, in the right direction. We must face the fact that parents can sometimes contribute to their children's wickedness if they fail to discipline them as they should. The wise man writes in Proverbs 19, verse 18, "Chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction." And in Proverbs 29 and verse 15, the wise man says, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." May I remind you that the Lord reproved Eli because he did not restrain his sons. God said in 1 Samuel 3, verse 13, "For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Parents can contribute to the waywardness of their children if they fail to teach them as they should. I asked Kevin to read to us from Psalm 78, because that psalm talks about the importance of passing on the torch to the next generation, if I can put it that way. Parents can contribute to the waywardness of their children if they neglect their children's training. The wise man says in Proverbs 22:6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." But we need to ask the question, what is this way that the wise man is talking about? Is he talking about the way that the child ought to go, either vocationally or morally? Or, as some have suggested, is he talking about the demands of the child's personality, conduct, or stage of life? Most of our English translations translate the verse in keeping with the first explanation. The New King James reads, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it." But the Legacy Standard Bible translates it this way: "Train up a child according to his way. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." And there are those who have suggested that the idea is that we train up a child according to his bent, his personality. If he wants to be a mechanic, we don't try to make him into a doctor or something like that. Well, I must tell you, I just don't really think that that explanation is the correct view. In the book of Proverbs, basically, there are only two ways that you can follow. There is the way of wisdom and righteousness, and then there's the way of foolishness and wickedness. And the book of Proverbs urges young people to avoid the path of wickedness and walk the path of righteousness. And furthermore, it teaches that the law of one's father and mother that children are to follow is ultimately based upon the law of God. But now that raises a question. Does this proverb mean that if you teach and train your children right, they're going to turn out right? And the answer is no, not necessarily. You see, this is a proverb. And proverbs, by their very nature, are maxims, not axioms. They are general rules. They are generally true, but there are exceptions. Do you remember the old spelling rule, I before E, except after C, as in receive? Or, when it sounds like A, as in neighbor and way. I didn't learn that part of the rule till I married Kathy. Of course, she's a teacher. But the fact of the matter is, folks, there's all kinds of exceptions, spelling exceptions to that rule. Words like either and neither and leisure and sees and weird and conscience and science, all of those words don't follow that spelling rule. It works a lot of the time, but it doesn't work all the time. Think with me about this proverb, Proverbs 10, verse 27. The fear of the Lord prolongs days, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. Well, what about John the Baptist? And what about Jesus? And what about James? Were their lives prolonged? What about Manasseh? Was his life shortened? What about this proverb, Proverbs 16, verse 7? When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Well, now, how did that work out for David and John the Baptist and Jesus and Stephen and Paul? Right here in this same chapter, in Proverbs 22 and verse 3, a prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Well, what about King Josiah? He went out to fight against Pharaoh Necho, and Pharaoh Necho said, listen, I have no quarrel with you, go home. And Josiah didn't listen to him, and he was killed in battle. Once again, Proverbs are maxims, not axioms. Parents can contribute to the waywardness of their children if they fail to set the proper example before them. And I can think of no better illustration of that fact than the story of David. David saw, coveted, and took another man's wife, and his sons walked in the footsteps of their father. Amnon saw, coveted, and took his half-sister Tamar. And Absalom tried to take his father's kingdom away from him. And Adonijah tried to take his brother's kingdom away from him. And so parents, the fact of the matter is sometimes you can contribute to the waywardness of your children. But I must say to you that if you have made serious mistakes with your children, there's still hope. You need to repent of that. You need to ask God for His forgiveness. You need to accept the forgiveness that He has promised you. Forgive yourself and go on. When I was preaching in Texas, I talked with the husband of one of our members about his unfaithfulness. And he explained to me that part of his trouble was that he just couldn't forgive himself for the effect that his unfaithfulness had had upon his children. If you've made mistakes, serious mistakes as a parent, God promises to forgive you if you turn from that and seek His forgiveness according to His will. If God would forgive David and Peter and Paul, He will forgive you. But after I have said all of that, please listen to me very carefully. Parents are not always responsible for the waywardness of their children. Good parents can have bad kids. Hezekiah was one of the best kings that Judah ever had, but his son Manasseh was one of the very worst. And Jehovah was the perfect father to Israel, and yet Israel rejected Him and rebelled against Him. So even the very best parents can have bad children. Even parents who do most things right. And even when parents have made some serious mistakes with their kids, and they are partially responsible, the child is still ultimately responsible for his own actions. Good children can come from bad parents. Josiah was one of the best kings that Judah ever had. And his father Ammon was one of the worst. The fact of the matter is, God expects us to rise above our raisin if need be. We all have the responsibility to choose to do right before God, and ultimately we cannot blame our circumstances or society or our parents. So may I say to you this morning, if your children are not serving the Lord as they should, you are not necessarily responsible for that. And your children are ultimately responsible for their own behavior and their own actions before God. The third thing that I want to share with you this morning is that God understands your pain. Since I am not a parent, I cannot understand it. I just never will experience the agony and the ecstasy of parenthood. My life just didn't work out that way. Other parents who have wayward children cannot understand your pain. Even your own mate, the closest person to you in life, probably doesn't understand exactly how you feel. But God knows how you feel. He knows because He's God. And He knows because He is a Father. He was a father to the wayward Israelites who disappointed Him time and time and time again. Listen to His words recorded for us by the prophet Hosea in Hosea 11, beginning in verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love, and I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and fed them. But just a few verses later, God goes on to say, my people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt Him. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me. My sympathy is stirred. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come with terror. God understands your pain because He is the Father of His wayward children today. He hurts too. And parents, He hurts more than you do, because He understands the ramifications of rebellion and sin much more than you possibly can. God understands your pain. And finally, may I remind you this morning that wicked children can change. Wayward children can change, however you want to say it. This is certainly illustrated by the life of Manasseh. I've already mentioned that he was one of, if not the most wicked king in the southern kingdom of Judah. So wicked, in fact, that God allowed the Assyrians to take him away, and in his captivity, he came to himself and he returned to the Lord. And then isn't that what the story of the prodigal son teaches us as well? He demanded that his dad give him his inheritance. He went off to the far country. He spent it in riotous living. And all of his friends flocked around him while everything was going good. But when the money ran out, his friends ran away, and he found himself in the pig pen feeding the hogs, coveting the food that they were eating. I remember as a boy seeing my grandma throw out the slop to feed the hogs. Anybody remember that? I've been somewhat hungry in my life. But I must tell you, I've never been so hungry that I'd coveted what the pigs were eating. But it was in the pig pen that he came to himself. And he said, the servants in my father's house have it better than I do. I'm going to go back home. I'm not going to ask for the place of a son. I don't deserve that. Just give me the place of a servant. And you know the rest of the story. Wicked children can change. And so if you are a parent of a wayward child, you need to keep longing and looking and loving and hoping and praying. And although it may seem hopeless to you, you need to remember that wicked children can change. And so if you as a parent are hurting, you need to remember that you're not alone. You're not necessarily responsible. God understands your pain. And wicked children can change. I really do think that if you'll remember these things, it will help you. And my prayer for hurting parents is that God will give them strength and comfort in the Lord Jesus. I mentioned just a few moments ago that God hurts because of his wayward children today. God hurts when people who have heard the gospel preached time after time after time, when they do not respond. God hurts when wayward Christians who know better do not do better. And he wants to have a relationship with you. And he's made that possible through his son Jesus. But you must respond to his love and mercy and grace. If you're in this assembly this morning and that's what you need to do, then we want you to have that opportunity right now as we stand and we sing.